Good evening and welcome to the New York Society Library. I'm Sarah Holliday, the head of events, and I am only standing up here to mention a couple of little points of business. First of all, if you have a cell phone or anything that might go bleep or fleetle during the presentation, I would ask you to silence it at this time. There will be plenty of wonderful content coming from this direction. Secondly, we do have books for sale by all three of our speakers this evening from our friends from the Corner Bookstore, and if you'd like to buy one or three books, Davi in the Peluso Family Exhibition Gallery can help you out after the event. Also want to mention we put out a very, very small tray of refreshments over here. Just thinking about a little evocation of food and memory, I went to look for madeleines. But there were no madeleines to be had on the Upper East Side today, not even for ready money, so I ended up with Eli Zabar's mother's cookies. He said the cookies his mother used to make seemed like food and memory, so do feel free to have a cookie or take one with you as the evening progresses. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to our wonderful panel of speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Giulia Melucci. I'm your moderator for the evening, and we're here to discuss and celebrate these two wonderful books by Susan Buckley and Don Drzal, Eating with Peter and The Bread and the Knife, respectively. So just for introduction, Susan Buckley is a New York-based writer, editor, and consultant. She's co-authored 5 young adult books on American history. She was the founding editor of Appleseeds magazine and has written many children's books for reading and social studies programs. And Don Drzal is a former cookbook editor and has published articles and essays in the New York Times, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, Food and Wine, and O Magazine. Between 2006 and 2016, she was a regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review. Her essays have been anthologized in, among other places, Eat Memory, Great Writers at the Table, edited by Amanda Hesser. So we are in the Society of Readers, I suppose, and hopefully we're in the Society of people who love food, because these books are both great works of literature and great works of food writing. So I think we want to start by talking about, and they're two very different books. Susan's book is a book about Peter Buckley, her husband, and it's a book where we get to know him. Dawn's book is about Dawn. It's a very personal reflection on what eating has meant in her life and how eating has been a constant in her life from the time she was a child. So tell me, both of you, starting with Susan, about your process. How did you get to the idea of writing a book?
Well, I've always been a great storyteller. I grew up in a family of storytellers in Louisiana, and so I'm always telling stories. And shortly after Peter died, unfortunately, I was in Louisiana telling stories to some good, dear old friends of mine. And at some point I said, yeah, Eating with Peter was always an adventure. And I've always been a title person, and it was like this little kachink, and I thought, that's a good title, Eating with Peter. And so I wrote one story within the next year, and then didn't do anything more for 10 years. I was writing children's books, and so I didn't start writing these. And then a dear friend of mine, who's, I think Dana's not here yet, did the illustrations in the book, said she wanted to have a little writer's group. So I thought, I don't know if I'm going to do that and have people reading what I wrote and telling me what they think of it. I don't know. But Dana's such a dear friend, and I wanted to help her, so I said, okay, I'll do it. So I started writing the stories. And I realized that food was an organizing principle, really, because we did a lot of eating, a lot of cooking, a lot of marketing for food, and it suddenly, the stories sort of began to sort of coalesce around food.
Okay, Dawn, what brought you to the empty page or screen to begin with? Is this on?
Yes.
Yes?
Well, I worked at Viking Penguin for many years, and when my son was about 1, he started crying when the babysitter left at night, so I quit. And I soon realized realized I was going to have to do something, so I actually came to the Society Library with a blank notebook, and that was in 2000, and sat upstairs where it was very quiet, where if you clear your throat, people give you a dirty look. And I love that. And I proceeded to write really bad short stories. And I actually sent my first short story to Rust Hills of the Atlantic. I wrote him a letter and I said, I was an editor and I want your honest opinion as an editor. What do you think of this story? And he actually wrote back to me and he said, this story is completely airless and stylized, and I suggest you do something else. And I wrote back and I said, actually, thank you very much, because I wanted your honest opinion. So I had this enormous suitcase full of journals when I moved to a new apartment. That was a couple of years later. And they were, I thought, there's some deathless insight in here. You know, fiction clearly was not for me. And they were incredibly dull, like just really, really dull. So I started to get really depressed, but they were punctuated with some descriptions of meals that were really interesting. Like I would actually forget that I was sitting there. So finally, this pattern began to emerge, and I realized when I wrote about food, I was interesting. When I wrote about everything else, it was really, really boring. So anyway.
But I knew you in publishing, so I knew you as a book person, and then after we were not working together anymore, I saw you as a food writer. You were writing about food all the time. So you had some idea about how food was important in your life, but when you got down to writing the book, I guess, you didn't think that food was something that was going to get you there.
Well, the same thing happened at the Times. You know, they asked me to review fiction once in a while. Then they asked me to review a novel about food, and that was really good. Suddenly they started asking me to review all the time. So I think they had the same perception. Yes. Yeah, because
sometimes food turns us into writers, I think, which is something we have all learned here on this panel.
Giulia is the author of a book that has my favorite title ever. I loved, I lost, I made spaghetti. Which is it's a wonderful book.
But Susan, were you aware throughout your life I kind of want to know about your life before Peter and how food fit into it, and how, after you met Peter, how obviously...
Well, I was primed for the food adventures that we had, because growing up in Southwest Louisiana, food was incredibly important. It was a big item of discussion, and it was, there was wonderful food all around, and I was a big eater from early on. So I think I was, very set for doing all these food adventures.
So let's have a little reading from the books, so we can get an idea of the feel and the adventures within. You want to start, Susan?
All right, this is part of a story about a trip in the early 1970s to Morocco. And the story is called Pour le plaisir des yeux. We started this adventure in Marrakesh. Today, the cities of Morocco are crowded with package tours, but then there were few tourists and even fewer who ventured off the beaten track. Since we intended to spend all of our time in Marrakesh and the souks, the rabbit warren of streets that made up the market, even super independent Peter recognized that we needed a guide. So our first morning at the Hotel Mamounia, then still more like the place Winston Churchill loved to stay than the glitzy jet-set hotel it is now, Peter approached the concierge. He explained that we would be using a guide for a full week, that at the end of the week we would undoubtedly buy some treasures, but that under no circumstances did we want to be taken in and out of shops for the first 5 or 6 days. It didn't work. The official guides of Marrakesh must have magnets in their shoes, but they were completely incapable of avoiding the shops. Just see these rugs, our man said. Pour le plaisir des yeux. We don't want to buy anything now for the pleasure of our eyes or not, Peter boomed, but to no avail. In the afternoon of day 1, we fired our guide. We spent the rest of that day in the extraordinary Place Jamal El Fna. The place looked like a North African version of a medieval fair. In the morning, it was filled with tradesmen, no women, selling fruits and vegetables. Barbers were cutting hair and giving shaves. One man came every day with his small bathroom scale. He earned his living by allowing people to weigh themselves for 1 dirham, then worth about a quarter. There were scribes too, men who could not read or write, sat earnestly in front of them, dictating letters to be sent or having them read documents that they then signed. By the afternoon, the square turned into a festival of performers. Black acrobats from south of the Sahara turned handstands. Indian men played flutes to make their cobras dance. Moroccan musicians played instruments that sounded exotic to our ears. And scattered around the square were storytellers who told one part of their story all day long. Storyteller and listeners all sitting on the ground in a circle. The next day, the storyteller moved on to the next chapter, and on every day until it was time to begin a new story. At the end of the day, I'm just skipping some stuff here. At the end of the day, with no guide, we sat in the Café de la Glacière, sitting in the cafe at the edge of the square. By the end of that first day, we were exhilarated, exhausted, and puzzled. How are we going to navigate the suits without a guide? As we sat drinking the ubiquitous mint tea, we heard psst down by Peter's elbow. Psst. It was coming from a small, scruffy teenage boy squatting beside us. "I am Mustafa," he announced himself in not very good French. He was a student, he said. Every male of a certain age claimed he was a student, we soon learned. "Do you need a guide?" he asked, and named a modest daily rate. Peter and I looked at one another, looked at the sweet and earnest face of the scruffy boy, and said, "Oui, bien sûr," in one voice. It was agreed that we would meet Mustafa at the cafe the next morning, that he would take us to the souks all day, and that shopping was not in the picture until later. The next day was heaven. Mustafa knew everywhere to go. Like the Place Jamal of Na, the souks were like something out of the Middle Ages. You walked along a street crowded with the people of Marrakesh, shops and workshops on either side, straw mats covering the sky overhead. Our one street was nothing but shops making and selling jewelry. On another, every open door revealed boys pounding metal to make cooking pots. On another, there were weavers, and on and on. By late afternoon, Peter and I were delightedly walking down yet another street, gaily colored yarns drying above our heads, when suddenly, out of nowhere, 2 Marrakesh policemen swept down upon us, grabbed Mustafa by the arm, and dragged him away, shouting in Arabic. We were stunned. What in heaven's name had just happened? After a restorative cup of mint tea at the cafe, we trudged to the edge of the square where our car was parked. As we sat in the car thinking, now what, we heard a familiar psst. Sure enough, crouching down next to the car was Mustafa, looking the worse for wear and rough handling, but plucky as ever. He explained the problem. He was not an official guide, of course, and the Association of Guides and the police were ever on the lookout for unofficial guides like Mustafa. Being an unofficial guide was utterly and strictly against the law, he said. Ever resourceful, however, Mustafa had a plan. And sure enough, for the remainder of our week in Marrakesh, it worked. Having mutually decided on an agenda for each day, Mustafa would walk ahead of us, never looking back at us, but directing a stream of information and directions over his shoulder. We followed, never letting him out of our sight, and highly amused by the whole escapade. It worked brilliantly. When it was almost time for us to leave for the south, Mustafa told us that his mother was very grateful that we were helping her son. She would like for us to come to dinner. We accepted instantly, realizing what an honor it was for Mustafa's mother to feel comfortable in inviting American strangers into her home. On the appointed day, Mustafa picked us up at the cafe and led, always walking ahead, back into a neighborhood we had never seen. Tiny mud brick houses crowded around small courtyards. Off of one little courtyard, sitting on the ground in front of her 2-room house, was Mustafa's mother. In front of her was a small brazier covered with what looked like a dented pie tin. Over and over, she put her hand into a bowl of batter and tapped it lightly across the hot tin. The minute she finished covering the tin, she began peeling off a sheet of pastry like a paper-thin crepe. She was making the pastry for a dish called pastilla, layers of something like phyllo dough, stuffed with chicken, sometimes pigeon, and spices. According to Mustafa, she had once worked in the kitchen of the king in Rabat and was famous for her pastilla. While Peter sat and tried to talk with Mustafa's mother, whose French was minimal, Mustafa and I went to a nearby market where he bought a live chicken to be killed and dressed at home and baked in the pastilla. For the rest of the day, we played our Follow Mustafa game, and then that night we dined on pastilla in the home of Mustafa. The pastilla was divine, one of the most delicious things I had ever consumed. The delicate, crispy layers crackled as you bit into a filling of chicken, cinnamon, ginger, and saffron. When I think back on the entire scene, I realize that Mustafa's mother must have baked this in a communal oven in their neighborhood, for there was no sign of an oven in their minuscule house. As we ate, Mustafa's mother shyly stood to the side, refusing to eat with us, only serving. His older brother and sister were a different matter, however. Both were far more educated than Mustafa, who probably hadn't been a student for many years. Listening to them talk bitterly about the French, the king, and the rights they felt deprived of, you could imagine even then a future Arab Spring. We had bought presents, I no longer remember what, but the greatest present was Mustafa's trust in us to bring us to his home. And what follows in the chapter are some adventures, all involving food, of course, in Fez and Casablanca, and some amazing meals. But after one very grand meal in Casablanca, I wrote, at the end of that evening, I thought back on the incredible span of meals that we had had in our 3 Moroccan weeks, from tea in a Berber tent to liveried servants in Casablanca. But there was no question in either Peter's mind or mine, the most wonderful moment, the one we would treasure forever, was eating Bastia in the tiny house of Mustafa.
So as you can see, Susan's book is full of these exotic trips to Marrakesh, France, Italy. They're going here for a month, they're going there for a month. You get 3/4 of the way through and she mentions that she has to get to an office. And you're like, she has a job? How do I get that job? Now, Dawn, I know for a fact, had jobs because we worked together many, many years ago. And she talks about work in her book. And she was doing some cooking during the time that she was at work. And she's going to read about that before a different dinner party.
Right.
Her life got similar to mine.
Right. A very different dinner party. My book, used to the microphone. As you may know, my book is alphabetical, so this is a blessedly abridged version of D is for dinner party. And it's not Morocco, it's Brooklyn. By a rough estimate, I threw about 100 dinner parties over the course of my first decade in New York. During my 20s and early 30s, few things gave me more pleasure than inviting 6 or 7 people over to eat a complicated dish I had read about in research, a much more time-consuming and serendipitous process in the years before every recipe imaginable was instantly accessible on the internet. My favorite dishes were elaborate peasant productions that people had spent generations arguing about. Choucroute garnie and paella, bourride and tagine. No doubt I was the only child in me trying to reproduce the holiday atmosphere of extended family gatherings, when the dinner table would suddenly swell from its usually 2 to 3 to 12 and beyond. My policy of never making any recipe twice kept life exciting, but it resulted in the occasional spectacular failure, like one evening's chicken in a bulletproof salt crust. When the hammer and screwdriver suggested by the recipe proved useless, I tried dropping it on the kitchen floor, where it chipped the terracotta tile and rolled up the refrigerator into a basket. When the armor finally yielded to a crowbar retrieved from the trunk of a neighbor's car, it was revealed that instead of roasting to golden brown perfection, the bird had steamed into something resembling a shrunken head. Nevertheless, most of these dinners were pleasant, and many were delightful. Just one, however, stands out in my memory as perfect. It took place on December 27th, 1990, a date I can verify because, at some point during the evening, an unexpected snowstorm began blanketing the city. The day before, my husband and I had flown back from a Christmas visit to my parents, who had loaded our carry-on bags with an enormous uncooked porchetta, 2 bottles of excellent Margaux, 1 of green chartreuse, and 2 boxes of liqueur-filled chocolates. One of the advantages of being relatively young and poor was that we could share our eclectic windfall without the fear of being judged. It was the 20-something version of sharing a care package at camp. Like much of our hospitality then, it had an impromptu purity that I never managed to recapture in later, flesher years. The hors d'oeuvres had long been decimated when the porchetta was finally ready. As we stood to filter into the dining room, everyone drained his wine glass in preparation for the Margaux aerating on the sideboard. In the center of the dining room, my grandmother's fruitwood dining table glowed like a candlelit island. We had dispensed as usual with the first course, and thick slices of porchetta were fanned out on a platter in the center of the table. Beside it was a huge bowl of potatoes fontecchio, a recipe from the Silver Palette Good Times cookbook. They were delicious enough to be one of the sole exceptions to my rule of never repeating a dish. Whole wheat potatoes roasted until nearly desiccated, cut in half and tossed while still hot with loads of minced garlic, extra virgin olive oil, fresh mint, salt, and pepper. Flanking the candlesticks were a basket of fresh semolina bread with sesame seeds from the Italian bakery on Court Street and a watercress and endive salad. When all the plates and glasses were filled, I paused to enjoy the lull of hungry people eating, the clinking of flatware punctuated only by appreciative murmuring. And then there arrived the moment I had been waiting for without realizing I was waiting for it. The real, if unacknowledged, reason I gave dinner parties in the first place. The moment when time stood still and I was suddenly suffused with the unassailable certainty that all was right with the world. A sense of sublime connection, not only with my guests, but also with whatever it is that makes eating the bread and drinking the cup the ultimate metaphor of spiritual communion. These moments were my secret, the closest thing I had to a religion. Until I read the dinner party scene in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse a few years later, in one of those exceedingly rare encounters in literature when we come across something so private that we have barely attempted to articulate it even to ourselves, I thought I was the only person to feel precisely this sensation. It was a shock to recognize myself in Mrs. Ramsay's joy as she served the buffon d'eau, perfect triumph to her guests. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a especially tender piece of eternity. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. This feeling unconsciously emanating from the guests that we constituted an island against the darkness outside made all the trouble of shopping and cooking and cleanup worthwhile. It was grace, produced by what M.F.K. Fisher calls the alchemy of hospitality. What distinguished my perfect dinner party from all the others was that the moment didn't evaporate at the beginning of the meal. It dilated, surviving even the transition back to the brightness of the living room. Without interrupting the single kaleidoscopic conversation that had begun over hors d'oeuvres hours earlier, our guests rearranged themselves on the sofa, the armchair, the ottoman, the floor, sipping chartreuse and making occasional forays into the boxes of foil-wrapped chocolate bottles filled with liqueurs that sat on the coffee table. There was something endearingly silly about the facsimile wrappings and the peculiar crunchy lining of alcohol-soaked sugar. My hostess duties discharged, I sat tucked into the corner of the ivory chenille sofa nearest the stereo, where my husband was happily playing DJ with his prized record collection. At some point later, all conversation abruptly stopped. One of those unaccountable angel passing over silences, as if an invisible hand had been held up. And then we heard it, or rather we didn't. An eerie neutron bomb, middle of the country stillness, wrong for Brooklyn. Running to the window, the ingenue raised the blinds to reveal an opaque curtain of pure white. Huge, heavy, steady flakes had blurred the familiar outlines of the street, like a white duvet thrown hastily over bunched up bedclothes. Someone looked at his watch and exclaimed disbelievingly that it was 4 o'clock in the morning. How had we all lost track of so many hours? It was the snow that, in muffling the street noises, had silenced the subconscious chronometer that city dwellers used to keep track of time. Suddenly, everyone was up, putting on coats, saying their goodbyes. A plan was hatched that the Manhattan contingent would walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, and the Park Slope contingent set off for home to Borum Hill. My husband and I, glad not to have to brave the cold, stuck our heads out the window, arms around each other's waists, to watch them whooping and laughing through the unmarked whiteness until they split into 2 groups at the corner and went their separate ways. About 15 years after that evening, I was staying at the inn at Shelburne Farms in Vermont with my second husband and our young son. Glancing up from my book on the lawn one afternoon, I saw the ingenue for the first time in a decade, sitting under a tree a stone's throw away. She was so deep in conversation with another young woman that their foreheads were almost touching. If I had thought about it, I wouldn't have interrupted, but she was so completely unchanged that the intervening years seemed to disappear, and I found myself standing in front of her and saying hello. She was polite enough to try to suppress a visible wave of irritation at being intruded upon, but when she looked at my face, it was as if she were surfacing from a great depth. After I repeated my name, she remembered who I was, but the warmth I expected didn't accompany the recognition. Without introducing me to her friend, she told me she was getting married at the inn that weekend. I congratulated her, and she thanked me, but she regarded me so coldly that I realized it was intended as a dismissal. I was clearly a petty irritation, like a fly that had landed on her dinner. Flushing, I hurriedly said goodbye and retrieved my book with as much dignity as I could muster. Walking up the steps to my room, I lifted my palm to my burning cheek. I understood from experience how she could have replaced her former life so thoroughly with a new one, but the shock of seeing that I had ended up on her memory's cutting room floor clarified that, until that moment, I had harbored the strange delusion that my old experiences were preserved somewhere, like a childhood bedroom, that they were still enacted in some shadowy form by the ghosts of the people who had shared them with me. Years earlier, in a periodic replaying of the dinner party in my mind, I realized that my relationship with every last person there, even the bond that was supposed to last forever, had turned out to be as ephemeral as the meal. This woman had been a player in the drama, and here she was in the flesh, having forgotten all about it, about me. That meant that my treasured memory was not a talisman I shared with all the others, not a mystical continuity transcending our ruptured connections, but merely a recreation I had staged in my mind and obsessively revisited. As I looked out at the whitecaps of Lake Champlain, I forced myself to summon up how each of those relationships had ended. It amounted to a catalog of human frailties, mostly mine. But as the bird said in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, humankind cannot bear very much reality. So I sank onto the faded chaise longue and ran the dinner party again from the top, putting the ingenue through her paces one more time, running to the window, whooping through the snow, back where she belonged.
Well, if there's any proof that food can turn you into a writer, it's that passage. It's just poetry. It's so beautiful, and I'm jealous of it as a writer, and I'm jealous of it as a dinner party giver, because I said to Del when I read this, I don't feel that way. But dinner parties, I always feel terrible for some reason, even though I know I'm a fantastic cook. So I'm jealous of her ability. I don't give a shit what that woman thought. If she didn't remember, it doesn't matter. You're right. The memory is yours, and she can't take it away from you. She's pearls to swine, for sure. So, Susan, I think from your book, I think that you kind of found out you were a cook, maybe. I want to know, like, what you both discovered through writing your book. In the end of your book, you're cooking on your own. Peter's gone, and you realize that there are people who know you and are asking you, oh, did he cook?
Yes.
And you're like, yeah, he did. And you only think of yourself in relation to him as a cook, but
25 years of Peter being the amazing cook, and I was remembering when I was coming over, we had a series of guest books, and they're full of all kinds of wonderful things, and one that I always remember is somebody who wrote, "You can't be an amateur eater when you dine with Susan and Peter." So food was, and dinner was always this very important thing, and I was essentially, had the great luxury of making dessert, and sort of putting everything on the table, but not having to plan and not cook, and always knowing that it was going to be something wonderful and fascinating. And it wasn't fancy food, it was just really wonderfully good food, and sort of always inventive. Peter sort of made up things as he went along. And so when Peter died, dinner parties had been such a big part of, not dinner parties per se, but having people around at dinner. There were always people, that were us and the kids, and then pretty soon, you added a couple of people, so there was a lot of entertaining of a lot of people. And that had been such an important part of my life that I couldn't give it up. But then the very first time that I had friends over for dinner, and they were old, wonderful friends from Louisiana who would have loved me if I had given them gruel. It would have been fine. But I remember just being terrified and so unhappy and so thinking, and it was fine. And pretty soon I discovered that I had, in all those adventures and that exposure to all these wonderful cooks and markets and whatever else, that I had learned how to put a meal together and how to make it work.
Do you think that, I'm going to get all feministy about this, it feels like Peter was an overshadowing presence. I mean, I'm sure he was incredible, but do you think that writing the book was an act of independence, like cooking and sort of finding yourself?
Well,
do you think that
I said in the introduction, I said, like all lives and all marriages, there were good times and hard times. This book is about the good times, because I really wrote it, because this was a very larger-than-life, fascinating, often very difficult man. And it was worth it all, but it was not always easy. And so this was a real chance, I realized as I was doing it, to remember all the good times.
So can we look forward to the unexpurgated eating with Peter? Me too. Eating with Peter.
Think about that.
Think about it. So Dawn, I'll just say that Dawn had to do something that would be just terrifying to any food enthusiast writer, which was that she had to cook for MFK Fisher. So and that story is in the book, but do you want to tease a little bit of that story for the crowd?
It's a wonderful story.
How did it happen, first of all? How was it that you, Dawn Drzal, editor of cookbooks, not yet an author of a memoir, how did you end up cooking for MFK Fisher? And how did it go?
Reluctantly. Yeah, it was a disaster. I, as an editor, worked on a book by David Halberstam that had driven another editor to epilepsy because he worked so long on the flickering screen, so he needed help. And as thanks, he gave me a first edition of The Gastronomical Me, an introduction to MFK Fisher, who said, come for lunch 3,000 miles away, so I did. And so I got there. No, exactly. So I got there, and her housekeeper just took it as an opportunity to leave for the day. And so, as you know, anybody who's read the book will know, her MFK Fisher said, how would you like to cook for me, dear? Statement. So I, of course, said, love to. And, you know, I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. Anyway, she said, an orphan boy shot a pheasant for me. It's on the counter. And pheasants are supposed to be hung, you know, aged, and this pheasant was very, very fresh. And so I thought, I will braise it in sauerkraut. And, you know, she looked at me and raised an eyebrow like, oh, not a fool. But then she got me. She said, rinse the sauerkraut. So now rinsing the sauerkraut, of course, you know, obviates the use of the sauerkraut, which, bitch. So I rinsed the sauerkraut, and of course, the pheasant is tough. But, you know, she really was defeating herself because she takes this enormous bite of the thigh, and it lodges in her throat. And I look, you know, I say, how is it? She doesn't answer. I finally look up, and she's purple. And, you know, and she's too frail for me to do the Heimlich maneuver. There are no emergency numbers next to the telephone. And, you know, this, like, banner flashes across my eyes, you know. MFK Fisher, dead at 80, aspiring author, kills MFK Fisher. And, I actually walked around behind her because I was going to do the Heimlich maneuver. I think it's better to break something than to have her actually die. And at that moment, this huge hunk of pheasant flies across the room. And she proceeded just to drink wine for dinner, and not a good thing for an 80-year-old. And so at the end of the meal, all of a sudden her wine glass crashes to the floor and, you know, sprays me with glass and wine. And she says, I bet you think I did that on purpose, don't you, dear? Well, yeah, I do actually think you did that on purpose. And also, in another story, in Times, her housekeeper left a dead mouse in my bag. Just, you know, just
Needless to say, she did not write the biography.
yeah. I think I was forewarned between the two of them. It's like, whatever happened to me, Jane? Yeah. So.
Well, you need to edit an anthology of MFK Fisher war stories.
Actually, all the people who tried and failed. Yeah.
So what do you think it is about publishing people in food? Because there does seem to be, that we're all publishing veterans, and there does seem to be a lot of...
All those lunches?
I think it is that. You get a lot of free meals, and you learn about food. Or at least we did back in the day. I don't know if that happens anymore. They probably get to go to the dig in now. But we did get to do that. That's part of it. But, I mean, as a writer, you control words. As a cook, you control ingredients, and you turn them into something magnificent.
You do get to
Yes,
tell
you do.
your side of the story. You get to write the history, right? You get to tell the final version.
But when you're cooking, you're saying something about yourself, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, writing is a better way to do it, I guess. But let me look at my questions. Well, I mean, would your biggest fear be now, what would be worse, cooking from F.K. Fisher or having F.K. Fisher read your book?
You mean the chapter about her?
The whole book.
Yeah. Gosh.
She'd probably be mean. She's mean. She sounds like she's a little bit mean. Well, she was old too.
I don't think she was
Really.
mean about people's writing, actually. She was pretty generous about people's writing, actually. She was.
What did you talk about of writers? What did she?
Well, I remember when I sat down with my tape recorder, I said, well, I don't really know what to ask you. She said, ask me anything, dear, and I'll tell you the answer. And I said, and she said, my first meal, my mother's breast. I thought, oh, God. This is not going to be easy.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's disappointing.
Yeah.
I think she'd be a little more upright than that. Or what about recipe testing? John, I guess you're a veteran of recipe testing as a cookbook editor.
Well, you depend on people to test their own recipes. And actually, there's somebody in the audience who wrote a cookbook for me, one of the first cookbooks I ever published, for a book called Essential Flavors. And I remember that she and her co-author decided that they wanted to have cherry tomatoes without the skins. And they wanted to, yeah, and I said, you can't do that. That's just too much trouble. And she and her co-author showed up at my door in Brooklyn with a pint of cherry tomatoes and knocked on the door in the evening and said, we're going to show you how easy this is. And they put a pot on my stove of boiling water. They said, see, you just throw them in and you just slip the skins off. And I thought, it is not that easy, but if you are that determined, I will let you blanch the cherry tomatoes. You remember that?
Real
And
cooks
I
don't do that.
I had a core of friends, several of whom are here, who were testing my recipes, because particularly the recipes that came from Peter. At one point, I'd get tired, because he loved to read cookbooks, but he did it mostly just almost never cooking anything from a recipe. And I'd say, oh, Peter, make that chicken that you made last week. And he'd say, I don't know how to make that. I mean, I couldn't remember. He wanted to do something new and different. And then we had the succession. So I started off and I said, okay, I'm going to write down the recipes. If it's really good after dinner, I'm going to arrange. I have a little tiny book and I'd write it down. But of course, the recipes would be things like, there was chicken yes dear, because that was really good. Then there was chicken yes yes dear, and then there was chicken yes 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 dear. So they had all kinds of crazy titles. But his way of writing the recipe was that basically to say, put some olive oil on it, put some salt and pepper, put it in the oven, do such and such, and eat it. I mean, these were not very precise recipes at all. And so I got people like Steve and Lynn, who are here, to be my recipe testers, which was.
Now, would your fear be, or would you have any fear of Peter reading the book?
No, I think he'd be amused by a lot of it. I mean, because a lot of it was the stories that are in here are stories that were of things.
Yeah,
that
it's
were,
not the unexpurgated eating with Peter that we're going to get in 2022.
But I think he would be amused by it. And by the way,
Maybe you would say, but you're not the cook. Get out of the way. Get out of the kitchen. You can write.
But, one of the questions you had asked Susan was, what did you learn about food and memory from writing the book? And, one of the things I learned was that, I feel like my past is like a chicken that I cooked in a stock that, all the flavor is gone. I have nothing left to say. But the other thing I realized was that, for me, people thought I was exaggerating when I said I only remember things because I ate something, memorable. It's the other day I was having dinner with my ex-husband and my son, which is another story. But, yeah, we were talking about going to Ireland, and I said, well, I know we went to Ireland, but I never went to Dublin. And I'm eating my food, and I hear this silence, and I look up, and they're staring at me, and he goes, oh, we spent a week in Dublin. She was like, we did? Like, I mean,
There was nothing to eat there.
yeah, exactly. That was really shocking. Clearly, we ate nothing memorable. But I mean, I was doing like this reading about how the hippocampus is where
Right.
your short-term memory is turned into long-term memory. Clearly, if nothing is eaten, it does not go into the long-term memory. It just doesn't go there, and that's really scary.
And I there were lots of adventures. Like we took an unbelievable trip to Egypt, but there wasn't any really exciting food. So I couldn't put it in the book because it didn't.
How did
But
Peter
you remember,
survive
right?
that?
You
Oh,
remember.
yes, yes,
See,
yes.
that's the difference.
That's true, that's true.
So how do you think that happened to you, Dawn? Was it because of your fabulous Italian grandparents?
No, I think it was because of my horrible parents. I mean, no, seriously, because I think that, nobody can tamper with your food memories. Like, those actually get
They can't
recorded.
be corrupted?
Yeah, as they were. But people can work on your other memories and tell you whether it happened or it didn't happen. So I think the only saved memories were the food memories. Yeah.
So what, did anyone come out of writing, I'm sure everybody did, come out of writing a book surprised by something you felt or something you learned by going into these stories and going deep?
I actually was surprised, speaking of my parents, how many good things my stepfather ended up doing, like intervening at important
It did sound that way. He even gets a recipe.
I know he does, but those who know me are raising an eyebrow. No, he did some really terrible things, but he also did some really important things. People are a mixed bag,
Yeah, we're all good and bad, and that is a good, lesson to learn in empathy, right? We're all trying our best. Some are worse than others, but we all have our good moments.
Right.
Yeah, and for me, it was really it was this opportunity to pull together all of these really funny, adventurous things that happened, and to sort of show the good parts of this very difficult person. Because these were things in which the sort of larger-than-life qualities often led to amazing adventures. And I was thinking at some point, somebody said to me, what advice would you have for people today where it's a very different food world and everybody knows everything and you can get millions of recipes and you can buy 87 kinds of balsamic vinegar and, the A&P, or not the A&P.
But it's not right.
In Christini's, when we made an entire trip to Modena just to get balsamic vinegar, which nobody in the United States had ever heard of at that point. But so somebody said, well, you can't do those things now, we have everything here. And I was realizing that my advice was be curious and make friends, were the sort of mantras that I would say, because that's really what was at the heart of Peter's. He was so curious that we would always finding ourselves having these adventures because of his curiosity. And it really, when it all really boiled down to being about the people. It was the farmers who were selling at the market, and it was the fact that we got to be friends with this 3-star chef, and he took us to the market, and it was all about sort of curiosity and friendship. And that,
He never did anything the easy way, right?
No.
He just like popped down to the corner to grab a head of
No.
Right. Yeah.
But this also was in it's sort of off the point, but one of the things that I realized in writing this, remembering all those years, was it was such a different world, because if you lived on the Upper East Side and probably the Upper West Side as well, there was this whole world of these little small shops. So, Peter, forget about going out and to the A&P, it was always going to be, calling up the butcher. And every morning he'd have a long conversation with the butcher and with Oscar at Empire, the fruit and vegetable place. And, it was all about all these people.
That's a big part of your book, the world that is gone.
It doesn't exist.
Possibly coming back in some ways. I mean, it seems like the young
market's
people
part.
are, the
market
market's
part
here. There are
so
people
good.
doing artisanal things, but I mean, things have changed dramatically in the past 50 years, more than they have in previous 400 years. You look like you were going to say something.
No, I was just looking at you expectantly.
I'm here. All right, so Dawn, what are you going to write next?
Actually, halfway through the second draft of a novel.
Is it going to incorporate food?
Didn't learn my lesson.
Yeah. Are you going to get food in there?
No, there's not one meal in there.
Really? But you feel good about it. You're feeling like you don't need food. You can kick off those crutches.
It's a young adult novel. I figured this is like
Very good.
I mean, I'm really tired of writing about food.
Myself, you didn't want to. You can't escape it. You can't escape it. It is you. And that's okay. Right, I'm going to look at my questions, but if anyone has anything they want to say, Susan.
Yeah, just do it. Does anybody in the audience have any questions?
Yeah, I guess we could move on to that.
Julia, I would love it if you threw in a few words about your book.
Oh,
Which I know is not
this
quite
is not about me.
It is now.
Also a food memoir.
I wrote a memoir, much like Dawn, I guess, since one of our topics is organizing principles. I was writing about my disastrous love life because I had one experience too far. And I was writing, and I thought what I was writing was really stupid, or not necessary, because this was during the time of Sex and the City, and everybody was writing about their dating, and who cares. But then when I realized that I was cooking for all these idiots who I was dating, that it made me unique, and my story unique, so I interspersed recipes with stories of my romantic disasters, which became my book. So I found, as I guess Dawn did, that, she has the great organizing principle of, I don't know that word, I was trying to look it up.
Abecedarian.
I want to use it all the
love
time,
that word.
abecedarian.
Whoever
It's an
needs to use
abecedarian. It is very nice to find a meaty hook to hang everything on, which I haven't found since I wrote that book, but
I have a whole other alphabet that I've written. Nobody's
I'm
asked
gonna
me
do my
to
Cyrillic
sequel.
book.
Just like that.
So that's my book. It's funny, and there are good recipes.
It's very
You
funny.
hate
It has
me.
wonderful recipes.
So I like food. I think food turned me into a writer, and I like being with other women who sort of had a similar trajectory.
Did either of you have people recognizing themselves in the descriptions of your dinner parties or your disastrous relationship?
I don't think Dawn is covering hers up at all, right?
I think you meant readers, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Julia's book's been out longer than mine.
My ex-boy? No emails from ex people.
No, actually, one of my former husbands said that my book was completely accurate, which I thought was really nice considering that some of what I wrote was not exactly flattering.
That's good that you have good self-aware people.
Yeah.
I've changed a name or two,
Uh-huh.
at my cousin's suggestion. but everybody else
Some
is.
people have said that they identified with the book, which was nice to hear. Yeah.
Yeah.
I had many different stories. I had my first boyfriend is one of my best friends, so he read it and he was allowed to edit his chapter, which he did, but beautifully, because he was a great writer. And then some people, some crazy ex-boyfriends of mine love it and think it's the greatest thing in the world, and then some I hate and I don't really care what they think. And some are dead, which is the best part of all.
I had somebody, a lawyer at a friend's, suggestion, read mine just in case. So I feel like anybody I hear from, I'm good. I'm safe.
It's an interesting publishing tidbit because in magazines everything is fact-checked and legally, magazines are responsible for their content. Book publishers are not really responsible.
The author is.
The author is. So nobody, my people are totally identifiable. Nobody ever and so far so
That's
good.
scary. No, I mean, when I wrote the MFK Fisher piece about the housekeeper who put the dead mouse in my bag, they seem more concerned with, are you sure her plates were Mexican green plates? I didn't know that. It's like, she said they were, you know? I mean, like, what do you mean? Like, what do you care whether they were Mexican green plates? And then there was this whole thing about whether it was a Picasso, like, etching in her bathroom. That was a big deal. Like, I almost had to go back there and check.
Why was the Picasso steak and the soup? Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, and with writing recipes, they're not fact checked. I mean, I could have put any garbage in the world in my book. No one would have known.
Well, until you got the angry letters.
Yeah, nothing has happened, but it's interesting how magazines and books are very, very different. And, I mean, we had some things in Viking where there were legal things, like David Levitt, but mostly it's a free-for-all.
I have questions. Could you explain the title of your book, Dawn?
Yeah. First I came up with some horrible, like, really, you're a title person, I'm the opposite. The whole thing was done, everything was done, and like, just, my agent said, you know, as wonderful as your book is, your titles are that bad. I was like, don't spare my feelings. She said, do you come up with something evocative? So I just had bought this book of food poetry, and there was the Billy Collins poem, Litany, which starts out with that, you know, what my epigraph, you know, you are the bread and the knife. And I thought, that's perfect, because, you know, bread is alive, it's experience, you know, and the knife is, you know, perception and analysis. So it seemed fitting to have both. Yeah.
But there's even a little bit of a religious tinge to that too. Not maybe the knife, but the bread, and also the dinner party, you talk about the bread and the wine. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? About how perhaps your religious upbringing informs your sense of spirituality beating?
Well, there was, you know, I think even people who are not religious, there's something about the language of the Bible, right? There's sort of rolling cadences that, you know, you can sort of tap into. But I think it was actually more having drunk just the right amount of wine. Because I can't say I've had quite that same experience since I quit drinking. So anyway, but I do think that there's a reason why, you know, that is the metaphor for, you know, communion, to, you know, use the word in both senses. There is something about inviting somebody into your home and giving them food that you prepared, not bought, you know, with your own hands. I think that it tastes different, and if it's prepared with love, I think people can feel that. I think that's something we've lost. I think we don't do it very often in the city. You know?
Yeah, we haven't touched upon that enough about food and love and what the connection is. But Susan, you were going to say
I'm just going to say, I'm always amazed at people who say that they don't ever entertain, you know, because entertaining or having a dinner party becomes having a dinner party as opposed to having people come to your house for dinner. That it seems to be something that people don't do as often, I think, as we sort of just did without, it was sort of taken for granted.
And it doesn't have to be a dinner party, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was just having friends and family
Yeah.
there for dinner. Yeah. Because I can't remember the number now, unfortunately, but I counted up the guest book and these guest books you have to sign.
The guest book thing is genius.
That you have to sign the first time that you come. And we got these because we were in Venice one year, and Peter had done a biography of Ernest Hemingway, and he had the pages, and he wanted to have a beautiful bound version. So it was one of our trips to Venice, and he went to the Legattoria Piazzese, and Signora Piazzese was this little tiny, feisty woman, and she did this beautiful bound copy of the Ernest, and then when we went to buy it, to pick it up, she had this beautiful little small book because the paper was so special that she couldn't stand to just not do something with it. So she made this little book that maybe half the size, trim size of this. And Peter and I both sort of, without even thinking about it, said, oh, we can have a guest book. So we started, and now on the 5th guest book, but it was something like 400, I think, from the time that we got this first inscription was in 1979, and Peter died in 97, and there was something like 400 entries in the guest book. And that was just people friends mostly coming for dinner.
I've seen those guest books, and there's one that somebody wrote that clearly was a very old man,
Oh, yeah.
written in this very tiny, tiny, precise, crabbed handwriting, and it was around Christmas.
It was Christmas dinner.
And he had wrote that, thank you for taking in a waif. This is my one connection with the human race. You take me in every year. You cook for me. You make me feel wanted. You make me feel loved. And it just brought me to tears. It was
They're
so
amazing.
beautiful.
He was about 90 years old. He was one of Peter's professors from Princeton. And he was this very tiny, Ira Wade was his name. He was one of the world's great Voltaire scholars. And, but he would come in, he'd take us in for Christmas dinner. And he'd sit there, he was very tiny. He wrote this little tiny, yeah. It was, yeah. But that's wonderful. I highly recommend it to everybody to have a guest book because it's just, and sometimes people, when people would say, oh, here, what am I going to write? I'd always say my very favorite one was a little boy who probably was traumatized for life, thinking that he then had to write in the guest book every time he went out to dinner. I'm sure he'd never been out to dinner before. His father brought him over, and he thought, and he tried to chew the pencil, and he wrote his name Walter at the top, like the school name, Walter. I thought it was a very nice time. And that's all he said. And it was just, so whenever anybody says, oh, what am I going to write? I say, that's my favorite, and everything. I thought it was a very nice time.
Are you still doing that now when
Oh,
you
yeah.
entertain yourself?
Absolutely. But the first guest book was 79, was like, took about a year and a half to fill up one book. And now, it's, because you don't ever have to do it after you've done it from the first time. So,
Oh, you only have to do it once.
yeah.
But you change. You never step into the same guest book twice.
This is true. Some people do write several times. They want to.
Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I have a question. Have you eaten each other's food? And if so, is there something in common that you would be able to discern?
No, I'm pissed off about that.
I think you better get through that.
Julie has made it very clear that she minds that she's not been invited over to dinner, so I'm doing it very soon.
Right.
I just met Susan, but I haven't I've never invited. But we had dinner together. That was fun.
Yeah, we went out to,
Right.
and I went to Susan's house and brought a sort of picnic, but.
That's right.
Yeah,
We have to,
we
yes.
haven't
Clearly a
cooked
dinner
for
is
each
a
other
dinner.
yet, yeah.
Or 3 dinners, actually.
That'll be my next.
Any other questions?
Have people read your recipes and commented on them?
I'm sure they all love the ones that you tested. Steve is one of the major recipe testers.
Did you have dinner parties to test your recipes? Or was it just a lab?
Yes, actually, Steve and Barbara, who's can't be here tonight, but Steve and Barbara had me over for dinner several times for the recipes in the book. That was-
I don't think anybody wants to eat most of my recipes. There's one for gruel.
That's right. Dawn's recipes are unique.
The stuffing, the stromboli stuffing, which I, make for Thanksgiving every year. It's actually quite good.
And that was your stepfather.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll try that.
But I certainly would highly recommend if you want it. Memoirs that sort of start off with, I was born and I did this and I did that. Always seem, even if and there's some wonderful ones like that, but they always seem a little bit sort of self-referential to me. And I never had any desire to do that. But if you can tell it as a story, I think.
I am born. That's Charles Dickens.
You should do it as a story. It makes a big difference.
Let's see if there's anything left to what we did say is that, Dawn, you call food a living metaphor. Why do you think food is such a good metaphor?
Well, I think, when you're finished the meal, all you have is the memory, right? And, that's true of life, too. It just takes longer. So, that's why.
It is the sense memories. I think Andy Warhol said something about smell and how smell is the most evocative thing, which it might be.
Well, it also goes straight to the
Right.
hippocampus.
You're all over the hippocampus. And that was before last week?
It was before last week. No,
Uh-huh.
you know, you eat it and it's, you remember it and it's gone. Not to be a downer.
Well, it's not, it stays.
What about leftovers? I always have leftovers.
Leftovers are a tricky problem, actually. They're a
Who
fascinating
was it? Was it
problem.
Calvin Trillin who said his mother only served leftovers? It was a great mystery. It was never the original meal.
Yeah, no, leftovers are delicious, actually. I love my leftovers anyway.
Thank you so much.
Are we done?
Thank you.
Thank you all.